The air is cold and still inside the bunker. Dust drifts through the beam of a single flashlight as gloved hands pry open a rusted metal crate. The hinges groan, a sound that hasn't been heard in nearly 80 years. Inside, film reels, sealed documents, and the faded insignia of a nation that no longer exists. The label reads, Project Nabel. For decades, it was just a rumor, a whisper among historians about Germany's secret atomic pursuit. But in 2022, beneath the quiet town of Haigerloch, the silence finally broke. What they found inside would rewrite everything we thought we knew about the end of World War II. Chapter 1. The Silence Beneath Haigerloch. In the spring of 1939, Europe stood on the edge of transformation. In Berlin, parades rolled down unter den Linden. Banners hung from every facade, and the sound of marching boots echoed through the capital. Yet beneath the spectacle, fear and ambition were quietly reshaping the continent. Germany had rebuilt itself from the ashes of humiliation after the Great War. Factories roared to life, scientists returned from exile, and the regime's promises of national pride consumed every conversation. Ordinary people, swept up in the tide, tried to believe in stability, but in the laboratories and military offices scattered across the Reich, something far more dangerous was taking shape. At Haigerloch, a small town hidden among the rolling hills of southern Germany, a group of physicists had been relocated from Berlin. They arrived under the pretense of research: theoretical physics, nuclear chemistry, radioisotopes. In truth, they were part of the Uranverein, the so-called Uranium Club, a desperate race to harness atomic energy before their enemies could. The work was meticulous, frustrating, and cloaked in secrecy. Every experiment was conducted behind reinforced doors, every document stamped Geheime Reichssache, top secret. Even the local townsfolk had no idea what was happening below their church, where tunnels wound through the rock like veins of buried intent. Across Europe, clouds were gathering. Britain and France watched with suspicion as Germany rearmed at unprecedented speed. The Soviet Union signed its uneasy pact with Hitler, buying time for both sides to prepare for the war they knew was coming. In the United States, distant yet alert, scientists began to share letters of concern. Men like Albert Einstein and Leo Szilard, who warned President Roosevelt that atomic energy could soon fuel weapons of unimaginable power. The letter would reach the White House in August 1939. A month later, German troops marched into Poland. The world erupted. Nations fell in months. Borders vanished in days. From the snows of Norway to the deserts of North Africa, the war spread like a contagion. And yet, through all the noise and fire, the work continued in silence. Inside Haigerloch's cavernous tunnels, Heisenberg's team calculated neutron flux and measured decay constants. Convinced they were chasing something revolutionary, they dreamed of a reactor, a device that could harness atomic fission to provide endless energy or endless destruction. The scientists were not soldiers, but they were bound by the state. Every week, men in black uniforms from the SS Technical Division arrived to collect data and deliver new orders. One of them, Oberstleutnant Karl Schaefer, kept a meticulous journal, a record that would never surface until decades later. "They tell us," he wrote, "that this work will secure the future of the Reich. But I see in these men's eyes the fear of what they're building. It is not energy they want, it is control." As the war deepened, the Reich's resources dwindled. The Uranium Club fractured, divided by ego, politics, and the impossible demands of a regime losing ground. Yet the experiments at Haigerloch never stopped. Villagers sometimes reported faint tremors underfoot, or the smell of metal and ozone drifting from the church cellar. Few dared to ask questions. By 1945, with Allied forces closing in, the research was hidden, the reactor dismantled, and the scientists scattered. Some surrendered, some disappeared. After Germany's surrender, the Allies moved swiftly. The American mission known as Alsos, led by Colonel Boris Pash and physicist Samuel Gaudsmit, swept across the ruins of Europe, seizing nuclear material and interrogating scientists before the Soviets could reach them. When they arrived in Haigerloch, they found remnants of a small experimental reactor, a sphere of uranium cubes suspended by wires in heavy water. It was primitive, incomplete, and yet terrifyingly close to functionality. Official reports claimed the discovery marked the end of Germany's atomic ambitions, but that was only half the story. Buried beneath the town, deeper than the Alsos team ever went, lay a second chamber. Sealed, unrecorded, and unmarked on any map. Construction blueprints suggest it was built late in 1944, under the supervision of the SS. No civilian scientists were allowed inside. Local archives describe shipments of concrete, lead shielding, and a special cargo that arrived under guard in January 1945. Then silence. The chamber's entrance was filled and forgotten, its existence erased from every post-war document. For decades, Haigerloch became a quiet footnote in the history of nuclear research, a curiosity for tourists, a preserved site of unfinished ambition. Historians debated how close Heisenberg had come to splitting the atom in a controlled chain reaction. Some called him a genius. Others accused him of deliberate sabotage, suggesting he never truly wanted to give Hitler the bomb. But the sealed chamber remained a mystery, dismissed as legend, until that morning in 2022, when a construction team drilling for new foundations struck something hollow. The sound was subtle at first, a metallic echo beneath the drill. Then came the dust, the rush of air, the faint smell of ozone. When engineers widened the gap, their lights revealed a narrow shaft descending into darkness. The air inside was dry, untouched, preserved by decades of isolation. Officials cordoned off the site, calling it a wartime storage cache. But when archaeologists descended, they realized they were standing in a room that had not seen human light since the final months of the war. On the walls, faded symbols of the SS Technical Division. In the corner, a row of lead-lined crates, each marked Project Nabel. The discovery would ignite a new chapter in the story of the atomic age, one hidden beneath decades of official silence. What those scientists were building, and why it was buried, would soon challenge every certainty about who truly controlled the end of the war. Chapter 2. Operation Glass Veil Declassified. The decades after the war were meant to bring peace. Instead, they brought a new kind of fear. By 1947, as the last trials of Nuremberg faded from the headlines, a silent conflict began to take shape. Not across battlefields, but in laboratories, intelligence agencies, and the fragile space between truth and perception. The United States and the Soviet Union stood like opposing mirrors, each reflecting the other's paranoia. The Cold War had begun, and information itself became the new weapon. In Washington, the newly formed CIA was tasked with more than espionage. It was a mandate to understand, to anticipate, and if necessary, to control human behavior. Across the Atlantic, the KGB was doing the same. Between them lay a shadow world of secret programs, psychological manipulation, sensory deprivation, and the subtle art of breaking the mind without touching the body. Officially, none of it existed. Unofficially, it was called Operation Glass Veil. For years, historians dismissed Glass Veil as fiction, a rumor buried in Cold War folklore. But in late 2023, a Freedom of Information request by investigative journalist Rachel Leone uncovered a forgotten cache of film reels stored deep within the National Archives. The boxes were mislabeled as Agricultural Study, Montana, 1958. When restored, the images were haunting. Families in small rural towns, filmed through two-way mirrors, subliminal patterns flickering across television screens, test subjects staring blankly into strobing light while unseen voices issued calm instructions. The footage was grainy, fragmented, but the implications were unmistakable. The declassified paperwork that followed confirmed it. Between 1958 and 1962, under directives signed by CIA Deputy Director Alan Dulles, Glass Veil operated under the guise of psychological resilience research. The program's goal: to explore how visual and auditory stimuli could shape cognition and behavior. In simple terms, they wanted to know how far they could go in controlling thought itself. A memorandum dated May 12, 1959, reads, "Subject response indicates high susceptibility when imagery is introduced at subthreshold exposure. Recommend continuation under project subset echo chamber. Coordination with military broadcasting assets approved." Beneath the typed lines, a name appears, later redacted in black ink. But fragments recovered from the carbon copy suggest Soviet awareness of the project, even cooperation. That revelation would change everything historians thought they knew about early Cold War ethics. As the reels were examined frame by frame, analysts noticed something else. Hidden visual marks embedded between frames. Cyrillic characters, sometimes inverted, often blurred. The codes match Soviet film stock identifiers from the same period. Could both sides have been working from the same template? The question sent shockwaves through the intelligence community. If true, Glass Veil wasn't a defensive experiment, it was a shared playbook. In 1960, one of the project's leading psychologists, Dr. Howard Lenz, wrote privately in his notebook, "They believe we are finding truth. What we are finding is obedience. We are building citizens who cannot see the strings that move them." 2 months later, Lenz disappeared while on assignment in East Berlin. His body was never found. His name was erased from the project roster the following week. When the Berlin Wall rose in 1961, operations like Glass Veil became nearly impossible to conduct openly. Funding was redirected through front companies, and many of the American scientists involved were quietly reassigned to new agencies. Some later connected to MK Ultra, others to experimental units in psychological warfare. The files vanished into archives and remained untouched for over half a century. The 2023 release changed that. As restoration experts digitized the films, they began noticing familiar faces, not of test subjects, but of those observing them. US and Soviet officers sitting in the same room, smoking, taking notes in 2 languages. Their expressions were calm, detached, clinical. On one reel, a man in uniform looks directly into the camera before the frame abruptly cuts to black. The next slate reads only, "Glass Veil, Joint Phase, Control Group B." What followed those experiments remains unknown. Most of the project's documentation was destroyed during the CIA's archival purge in 1973, following internal inquiries into unauthorized human testing. The fragments that survive tell a story of competition that quietly became collaboration, where the fear of ideological defeat drove both superpowers to mirror each other's most dangerous ideas. Rachel Leone's documentary team later interviewed surviving intelligence officers. One of them, now in his 90s, spoke on condition of anonymity. His voice, fragile yet steady, recalled the final days of the project. "We thought the Soviets were doing it to us," he said. Then one day, a courier brought over a film reel from their lab. Same patterns, same timing, same sound. That's when I realized we were doing it to ourselves. Glass Veil was officially terminated in 1963 after an embassy annex in East Berlin was destroyed by a mysterious explosion, killing 2 American agents and 1 Soviet liaison. The event was never publicly linked to the project, but a final memo, marked Eyes Only, hinted at the cause. Subject Group C achieved synchronized collapse following prolonged exposure. Recommend full termination of Phase 4 pending incident investigation. No further records exist. Today, the Glass Veil films sit in temperature-controlled vaults under restricted classification. Portions have been released to academic review, though many reels remain sealed. Experts describe them as the first true weaponization of perception, the origin of information warfare, a conflict fought not with bullets, but with beliefs. And yet, for all the evidence, one question persists. Who designed the imagery itself? Analysis suggests the patterns were not drawn from any known Western or Soviet visual archive. Some of the mathematical sequences embedded in the frames predate both nations' computational capabilities. Perhaps they were shared through defectors or remnants of earlier, hidden wartime research, experiments that began long before the Cold War ever did. If that is true, then Operation Glass Veil wasn't the beginning of psychological warfare. It was the continuation of something older, something buried, something that started in the chaos of World War II, when nations learned that controlling truth could be far more powerful than controlling weapons. The film reels flicker, the images loop, and the silence between frames seems almost deliberate, as if the past itself is whispering a warning to anyone who dares to look too closely. Chapter 3. The Frozen Archives of Novaya Zemlya. The wind howls endlessly across Novaya Zemlya. Ice grinds against ice, and the horizon glows a dim, ghostly blue beneath the polar sun. For decades, this place has been known only as a wasteland of frozen rock, a place where the Soviet Union tested its most powerful secrets. But beneath the ice lies something far older than any missile or bunker, something that remembers. It was the summer of 2019 when a team of Russian climate researchers arrived on the island's western coast to drill ice cores for carbon studies. They expected data, not history. At a depth of 20 meters, their equipment struck metal, a hollow echo that had no place in nature. Excavation revealed a steel hatch sealed with the emblem of the Soviet Ministry of Medium Machine Building, the same agency responsible for the USSR's nuclear weapons program. The lock was welded shut from the inside, When they finally opened it, the air that escaped was stale and chemical, preserved by the cold. Inside, they found a narrow tunnel leading to a small, windowless vault. On the walls, frost-covered pipes and faded stencils. Sneg 13. Sneg 13. At first, the name meant nothing. But in the weeks that followed, the team would uncover one of the most disturbing chapters of the Cold War. One hidden beneath layers of ice, secrecy, and denial. Declassified Soviet documents later confirmed that Sneg 13 was an auxiliary program attached to the Novaya Zemlya test range between 1959 and 1962. Officially, it was an environmental monitoring initiative. In reality, it was something far darker. Buried in the vault were metal canisters, film reels, and spools of magnetic tape, each labeled with test codes, coordinates, and the initials of unknown scientists. When restored, the tapes revealed field recordings, Geiger counters ticking faintly, the crackle of radio transmissions, and human voices, calm, methodical, and cold. Test group relocated, one voice says. Reading stable. Begin phase 2. At first, analysts believed they were listening to instrument logs. But then came the sounds of coughing, of a child crying, of footsteps in snow. The tapes weren't from test bunkers. They were from villages. Historical cross-references revealed something chilling. During that same period, several small settlements along the Kara Sea coast disappeared from Soviet maps. Official reports blamed population relocation due to contamination risk. But the recovered Sneg 13 archives suggest those populations were not relocated at all. They were observed. The data focused on long-term exposure to radiation drift following atmospheric tests. Civilians were never informed. They became, unknowingly, the subjects of one of the largest human endurance studies in history. By the early 1960s, Soviet scientists were competing with the United States, not just in arms, but in data, biological, environmental, and psychological. Understanding how the human body responded to radiation was considered vital to space exploration, battlefield readiness, and nuclear survival. Western programs like Project Plumbob and Operation Argus conducted similar tests, though not on this scale. What made Sneg 13 different was its precision. The researchers didn't just monitor populations. They categorized them by age, occupation, and genetics. Every variable measured, every life reduced to a line in a chart. Among the materials recovered in 2019 was a single handwritten ledger sealed inside a glass container. Its ink had faded, but the entries were still legible. They detailed radiation levels, weather patterns, and physical symptoms over 12 consecutive months. Each entry ended with a single notation, nablюдать, continue observation. The final entry, dated September 14, 1962, reads, Subject 47 terminated. Relocation complete. There is no indication of where relocation meant. When word of the discovery reached Moscow, the site was immediately classified. The research team was recalled. Officially, the vault had no historical significance. But one of the scientists, Dr. Irina Sokolov, leaked photographs of the artifacts to a journalist contact before disappearing from public view. Those images, of radiation suits, of sealed canisters marked with red danger symbols, went viral. Within days, the world began asking questions the Russian government did not want to answer. Western intelligence agencies quickly took notice. A declassified CIA memorandum dated December 1963 references foreign biological observations in the Arctic sector and confirms that the United States had full knowledge of Sneg 13's purpose. The memo concludes, information exchange agreed upon to avoid escalation. No disclosure recommended. In other words, both sides knew and both kept silent. As modern analysts pieced together the recovered tapes, they found something even more disturbing. Background radio chatter revealed the presence of American-supplied instruments, Geiger models exclusive to NATO operations. It appeared that somewhere between open hostility and détente, secret collaboration continued under the ice. The same fear that once divided the world had now united its most powerful enemies in secrecy. Dr. Sokolov's last public statement before vanishing was brief. We built our civilization on the silence of the dead. Her words would become a rallying cry for historians and activists demanding full declassification of Arctic test records. To this day, that request remains unanswered. Forensic teams who examined the SNEG-13 site later reported elevated radiation levels still emanating from the surrounding permafrost. But what they also found, buried under the frozen soil near the vault, was something unexpected. Small personal items. A child's toy, a pair of spectacles, a metal tag engraved with a family name and a date. 1961. These relics humanized the data. They gave shape to the faceless subjects listed in the archives. Every number represented a life that was lived, observed, and erased. No graves, no memorials, just coordinates and codenames. Satellite imagery of Novaya Zemlya today still shows the scarred terrain where craters mark the detonation sites. The Earth there is restless, thawing, shifting, revealing more each year. As the climate warms, more vaults may surface, and with them, more truths long buried under ice and politics. In the end, the discovery of the frozen archives was not only about radiation or war. It was about the lengths to which nations will go when fear and secrecy outweigh morality. The Cold War was fought on many fronts, in space, in science, and in silence. The ice simply preserved the evidence. Some say the tapes of SNEG-13 end abruptly, with a distorted signal and a final transmission in Russian. The experiment is complete, God forgive us, but there is no confirmation. The recording fades into static, then nothing. Only the endless wind remains, carrying across a landscape that still hides what men once chose to forget. Chapter 4. Echoes of Operation Harbinger. The warehouse at Lincolnshire Airfield had been abandoned for decades. Its corrugated walls corroded by time, its floor littered with dust, feathers, and forgotten tools. For years, the place was nothing more than a relic of Britain's fading wartime glory. But in the spring of 2021, as a real estate developer surveyed the site for renovation, workers struck something embedded beneath the hangar's concrete floor. Steel crates, sealed with bolts and stamped with a fading insignia, the winged crest of the Royal Air Force. Stenciled beneath it, in flaking white paint, were the words, "Do not reopen, Harbinger files." At first, officials believed they had stumbled upon old maintenance records or leftover ordnance. But when specialists pried open the first crate, they found something far stranger. Delicate circuitry, metal fins, and a guidance core that looked decades ahead of its time. The discovery triggered immediate intervention from the Ministry of Defense. Within 48 hours, the entire site was sealed, fenced off, and reclassified as restricted ground. Quietly, historians and engineers were summoned to piece together what these remnants once were, and why the British government had buried them so carefully. Through weeks of analysis, a pattern emerged. The recovered components matched no known missile from the 1950s or 60s. Yet internal serial numbers and wiring suggested collaboration with American contractors active during that same era. Hidden among the fragments was a single folder, its pages warped but legible, marked Operation Harbinger, Prototype Guidance Integration. Inside were correspondence logs dated 1954 through 1956. Referencing autonomous navigation trials and payload stabilization under biological parameters. It wasn't just a missile, it was a weapon designed to deliver something alive. Historians now believe Operation Harbinger was one of the earliest attempts to merge biological research with guided delivery systems, a Cold War experiment born from fear of Soviet advances in bacteriological warfare. After the Second World War, both sides scoured the wreckage of defeated nations for scientific talent and knowledge. Project Paperclip brought hundreds of German scientists to the United States. Britain quietly conducted its own version, recruiting former Luftwaffe and Wehrmacht researchers with experience in aerodynamics and chemical dispersal. Harbinger was their creation, a weapon that could think, navigate, and adapt, decades before modern drone technology. Among the papers recovered at Lincolnshire was a handwritten letter from Wing Commander Alan Reeve, Harbinger's project director. Dated February 3, 1956, it reads, "The Americans call it autonomous guidance. I call it intuition, a weapon that chooses its own path once released, but it comes at a cost. We've made something we no longer fully understand." 3 weeks after writing that note, Reeve vanished during a scheduled test flight off the North Sea. His plane was found days later, adrift and empty. The official report cited instrument failure. Unofficially, his name was stricken from every Ministry of Defense record within the year. As more documents surfaced, a darker narrative took shape. Project notes referred to a subject identified only as Asset H-19, described as biologically responsive to electromagnetic command. What exactly that meant remains unclear. Some historians speculate it involved early cybernetic testing, attempts to integrate living tissue with machine control systems. Others believe H-19 was not a device, but a human test subject, a pilot enhanced through unapproved biological experiments intended to interface directly with the missile's control core. The line between science and ethics, already thin in the 1950s, disappeared completely inside Harbinger's walls. Eyewitness accounts from former RAF technicians, recorded anonymously in the 1980s, describe unusual security surrounding a particular hangar during that period. Guards posted around the clock, orders delivered verbally, equipment arriving in unmarked convoys escorted by military police. "We thought it was nuclear," one retired engineer said, "but the air smelled different. Not like fuel or metal, more like a hospital." Whatever was inside that hangar was not just another machine. The last test flight associated with Operation Harbinger occurred on June 17, 1956. Records indicate a successful launch from the Lincolnshire coast toward a controlled impact zone in the North Sea. But minutes after takeoff, communication ceased. Radar tracked the object veering off course, accelerating, turning, then vanishing from radar entirely. Search teams scoured the area for weeks. Nothing was found. The project was officially terminated 6 days later, and all remaining materials were ordered destroyed under Emergency Directive H-19A. Except, as the 2021 discovery proved, not everything was destroyed. Within the sealed crates found under the airfield, investigators uncovered not only the guidance fragments, but also a small black box. Its label faded to near illegibility. When powered, the device emitted a faint repeating signal, a simple rhythmic pulse. Analysts determined it wasn't random. It was a code using pre-digital RAF transmission intervals. When decoded, the message was brief, almost human. Mission incomplete. No one has been able to trace its source. The British government has never publicly commented on Operation Harbinger. Requests for information are met with silence or redacted statements citing national security exemptions. In the United States, declassified Air Force memos from the same period reference a joint Anglo-American atmospheric dispersal initiative, but all technical data remains classified. Whatever Harbinger truly was, missile, drone, or something stranger, its existence was designed to vanish with the men who built it. Some of those men, decades later, would leave clues. A photograph discovered in Reeves' daughter's attic shows her father standing beside two unidentified Americans. On the back, written in pencil, are the words, "We made it fly. God help us if it learns to return." When modern engineers analyzed the recovered guidance fragments, they discovered materials far ahead of their time, alloys used in aerospace construction that didn't exist in manufacturing catalogs until the late 1970s. How those metals were produced in 1956 remains unexplained. It suggests Harbinger was part of a network of black projects operating beyond even the highest classified levels, projects that tested the boundaries of both physics and morality. As restoration crews sealed the Lincolnshire hangar once again, one government official reportedly remarked, "Some discoveries should stay buried." But for those who've studied Harbinger's remnants, the past refuses to stay quiet. The recovered black box still pulses occasionally, its signal unchanged. When amplified through modern equipment, the rhythm aligns eerily with early human heart rates. A coincidence, perhaps, or something else. Operation Harbinger was more than a project. It was a mirror, reflecting the paranoia of a world that had survived one apocalypse only to build the tools for the next. It reminds us that innovation and fear have always been inseparable, and that the silence of sealed archives can be far louder than the noise of war. And somewhere beneath that silent airfield, history still breathes, waiting for someone someday to open the crates again. Chapter 5. The Redacted Submarine of Yokosuka Bay. The waters off Yokosuka Bay are calm now, a quiet blue mirror stretching toward the horizon. Fishing boats drift lazily over the same sea that once held the weight of empires. But beneath those waves lies something the world was never meant to find. In 2024, a Japanese marine archaeology team investigating patterns of coastal erosion discovered a metallic anomaly buried deep beneath the seabed. It was long, smooth, and impossibly intact for its age. When divers descended, they brushed away the silt and revealed a shape that stopped them cold, the hull of a submarine that appeared on no registry. bearing no nation's flag. At first, they assumed it was a lost Imperial Navy vessel from the Second World War. The bay, after all, is littered with remnants of Japan's maritime past. But as the divers explored further, the mystery deepened. The hull's design didn't match anything from the 1940s. Its contours were sleek, seamless, more advanced than anything even the US Navy had fielded until decades later. And there were markings, faint but still visible, numbers etched into the metal that began with a prefix used by American contractors in the 1950s. It made no sense, a submarine from a future that shouldn't have existed. News of the find was quietly suppressed. Within days, the Japanese Maritime Self-Defense Force cordoned off the area, citing hazardous materials. The archaeological team was instructed to cease all excavation. But by then, they had already recovered an object from the site, a small, corroded briefcase wedged near the sub's control console. Inside were several film negatives and a sealed diplomatic pouch bearing the faded seal of the US consulate in Tokyo, dated April 1952. The pouch was marked, Eyes Only, Tidefall. The code name had never appeared in any known naval archive, but when intelligence historians examined declassified post-war records, fragments of correspondence between the US Navy and Japan's remaining wartime, engineers surfaced, all referring obliquely to joint technological recovery and post-conflict resource utilization. The implication was staggering. After Japan's surrender, covert cooperation between American intelligence and remnants of the Imperial Navy had continued. The submarine beneath Yokosuka might have been part of that alliance, a secret experiment bridging former enemies under the banner of Cold War expedients. The US government, when pressed, offered a familiar refrain, no comment. But internal documents obtained years earlier through FOIA requests hinted at a program known as Project Tidefall. It was an initiative intended to repurpose captured German and Japanese engineering assets into a new generation of undersea technologies. The goal was to develop a vessel capable of undetectable infiltration beneath sonar, a true stealth submarine. For reasons still unknown, Tidefall vanished from the record in 1953. Its funding evaporated, its personnel reassigned, its documentation sealed under multiple layers of classification, until Yokosuka Bay gave up its secret. Forensic analysis of the recovered materials revealed something even more curious. The submarine's propulsion system was unlike anything seen in the early 1950s. An early magneto-hydrodynamic drive, decades before such technology became practical. It used electromagnetic fields to propel the vessel silently through water, leaving no cavitation, no wake, no trace. Its reactor core, though inert, was small, impossibly small for its supposed time of construction. Metallurgists examining its composition found alloys resembling those developed in American labs during the 1970s, though isotope dating confirmed a mid-20th century origin. The deeper they looked, the less sense it made. Within the diplomatic pouch, alongside the negatives, was a handwritten memo. The ink had bled, but one sentence remained legible. Joint Command will deny all knowledge. Recovery to proceed under classified maritime jurisdiction. Vessel designation, S-17, Prototype 1. There was also a signature, illegible, except for two letters. VR. Some researchers believe this referred to Vice Admiral Vern Reddick, a US naval liaison stationed in Japan at the time, known for overseeing covert engineering projects. If true, it would confirm American involvement not only in post-war reconstruction, but in the secret continuation of wartime research under a new name. When the Japanese team's findings leaked to the press, the official response was swift. Interviews were pulled, articles retracted, and several researchers were reassigned to unrelated government posts. Privately, one diver spoke to a filmmaker months later. His voice was low, uneasy. There was something inside, he said. Not a body, something built. The shape of a man, but wrong. Metal bones. The torso was open, like someone had been trying to remove a power source. We were told to leave it, then the water filled in again. Subsequent sonar sweeps showed that the submarine had shifted position after the excavation, as if the seabed itself had closed over it. Officially, no further dives were authorized, but a handful of unauthorized sonar images, leaked anonymously online, appear to show the hull now partially collapsed, the interior flooded. What remains most disturbing is the faint electrical signature recorded in those scans. A pulse, repeating every 7 seconds. Too regular to be natural, too weak to be modern, a heartbeat in the deep. If Project Tidefall was real, it represented more than a technological experiment. It was a reflection of a post-war world that blurred the line between ally and adversary, between conquest and cooperation. The same men who fought each other in the Pacific may have later stood side by side in hidden shipyards, building something neither side could fully explain. And when the experiment went wrong, when a machine designed to vanish refused to die, they buried it under the ocean and buried the truth with it. Today, the coordinates of the site remain classified. The Japanese government refers to it as an environmental hazard zone. American archives list the entire region as irrelevant to national defense. But those who have seen the photographs, the curved hull, the faint American markings, the strange fusion of East and West, know better. History is written by what we choose to remember. The ocean, however, remembers everything. As the waves lap against Yokosuka's shore, the silence feels deliberate, almost rehearsed. Fishermen say their sonar sometimes flickers when they pass over a certain patch of water. Divers report hearing faint metallic echoes, rhythmic and distant, like machinery turning somewhere far below. No one knows what still stirs beneath the silt, only that, once, men tried to build something that could move unseen through the darkest waters, and that somehow it never stopped moving. The redacted submarine of Yokosuka Bay remains sealed beneath layers of time and secrecy, a relic of a world obsessed with control and invisibility. But perhaps the most haunting part of all is not what it was built to do, but what it was built to hide. In the end, as with every great secret of war, it was never about the weapon itself. It was about the silence that followed.